It's fast approaching fall when a woman's fancy turns to finding a performance broom, putting on her best hat, and flying off into the night. Last year, the first tree I noticed turning color was our next door neighbors. Unfortunately, the city had them trim down their trees, so this year the first tree I saw changing is ours. And it's a beautiful sight. It means Halloween is right around the corner, and I need a new hat. I've previously tried to crochet myself a fun witch hat, but they were a little big, quite heavy, and didn't fit exactly as I'd want. Not exactly the sort of thing I'd go gallivanting around in. I have one of those cheap black hats you can get off Amazon, and it's okay, but kind of plain. The hat I want to make will be covered in embellished patchwork, aka crazy quilting. It's not a completely original idea. There are other patchwork witch hats out there on YouTube. I got this specific idea from Instagram, and it was kind of a cool coincidence. I was looking up the editors of the Curvy Sewing Collective a while back to see what they were up to in a completely non-creepy way, kind of a where are they now moment while I was editing my plus size patterns video. Technically research. One of them, Maggie Who Sews on Instagram, had a photo of herself in an autumnally shaded witch hat hacked from the serpentine hat pattern by Elba Textiles. I had been on the Elba Textiles site earlier that day looking at the men's patterns because husbeast, and I'd been looking at the serpentine hat for myself because I was considering making myself a sun hat. I've literally been burnt by not having one. It's how I know it takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes for me to turn red as a ripe tomato in south central Saskatchewan. The only place in Canada I have successfully sat on a patio and read a book without becoming a crispy critter is Vancouver. Having a well-fitting pattern that would allow me to make an easy-to-pack sun hat, in which to, of course, live my best practical magic aunt fantasies, is on the list of things to do. Because no matter where I am in this vast northern country, not burning to a cinder is one of my ultimate goals. I looked at Maggie Who Sews hat and I thought, yes, but what if it were crazy quilted? And here we are. Obviously, if you want to follow along, you have choices. You can head out to the wild woolly internet and get any number of witch hat patterns, mostly available for free, or you can purchase the serpentine hat pattern like I did and follow along. Whatever option you choose, be sure to read the pattern instructions and or use an accurate cloth tape measure to find out what size will fit you best. Maggie's Instagram mentions modifying the hat to have a point and flattening the brim. From the looks of the pictures on Instagram, the hat band was modified by drawing a line up the center of the pattern piece and then angling in from the sides. Then you cut two of the vaguely house-shaped pieces and seam together at both sides before adding the brim. You just ignore the crown entirely. It looks good on Maggie, but I kept thinking about those curves on each side and wondering if there was a way I could avoid that. This is going to be a bit of an experiment. I traced a second pattern piece for the band, overlapped and taped it on the first piece as if they were sewn together or cut on the fold without that side's seam allowance. I drew my center line up from the middle and then folded my paper on that center line. The hat will be about 15 inches give or take from the base of the band to the tip, so I drew lines down from there to the other edge and then cleaned up the area of the join with a slight curve. My thought is that it'll give it a little room for the hat to cup the back of my head, and if it turns into a hat that wants to scrunch down a little bit, gives a little shaping for that. Because it's based on a sun hat, it's not going to have precisely the same shaping as a traditional witch hat, and I'm okay with that. I think I'm going to be more likely to wear it if it's comfortable and practical. I think I'd rather wear a hat that accommodates the shape of the human head rather than the hat distorting, because human heads aren't generally cone-shaped. Generally, the pattern recommends making both outer and lining layers out of a highly structured woven fabric like denim or canvas. I'm going to see what twill I have left over from various projects. If necessary, I can piece things together, particularly since the outer layer will be covered by the patchworking. There's some canvas in the stash from Mum's brief detour into bag making, so that's also a possibility. I figure I'll just use some black broadcloth for the lining. The pattern recommends using a stiff interfacing. I'm somewhat ambivalent about that. The hat doesn't need to be stiff as a board, I just want it to be able to break into a comfortable level while keeping shape where needed. Some of this video is going to be done through voiceover because someone had to have a root canal and doesn't feel like being chatty this episode.
That's because my face hurts.
So right now, while I'm not on any sort of medication stronger than Advil, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for watching. If you could stay until the end, that would be awesome, but otherwise, if you have a moment to boop the like button, subscribe if you aren't, and maybe leave a comment, I'd be much obliged. I'd also like to thank my Craft Coven, Patreon patrons, and channel members for all their support. I've really been enjoying waking up to your comments first thing in the morning because I have a bad habit of uploading late at night and then crashing. I really need to get better at this whole editing in advance thing. Alright, back to making something awesome. My stash of scraps is constantly growing, which is one of the drawbacks of sewing one's own wardrobe. That said, this is a great opportunity for me to go through the scraps from recent projects and add to the patchwork bin. From there, it's a matter of choosing the colors and patterns I want to work with. I'd like to work with a color theme if possible, rather than a true hodgepodge. Make the work more cohesive and less clown barf. I've become more aware of collecting fabrics for crazy quilting since I started playing around with embellished patchwork. As a result, I check out remnant bins at the local fabric stores or see whether they have baggies of offcuts. I found a bag of wool fabric scraps at one of the local quilt stores where they also have some absolutely fantastic threads, ribbons, and other embellishing media. I remember asking them, since they make fully cut out kits for sale, whether they also sold scrap cotton for patchworkers, and the lady behind the counter seemed surprised that anyone would want such a thing. Is that really so odd? I picked up the remains of a charm pack at the Ujamaa Grandma thrift sale this past spring. The squares are a good size to cut down for chaotic patchworking. Not seen on this project is the bin of stuff I consolidated from my mother, which includes a vast amount of solid colored swatches from when she was a color consultant in the 80s. I think there's also some cotton she picked up for experimenting with quilting, possibly in the 70s or 80s. Either way, I couldn't be arsed to drag out the bin. We're working solely from my scraps this time. You might recognize some of the fabrics if you've been around for a while. Or you might want to go on the hunt to see if you can find them in some of the old videos. And then there's things like rickrack, ribbons, bits of lace. I not only raid the stash, but keep the less successful tatting samples I make, and if I see inexpensive ribbon samplers at Michael's, I snap them up. Well, the Halloween ones at least. You can also save up patches, and if you're the type to go to conventions where they give out those satin ribbons for different events or panels, you can incorporate those as well. All sorts of interesting things you can do with crazy quilting. Basically, if it's fabric or tangentially related to sewing, it's fair game. I'm working flat for as long as possible. I have my stitch line and the seam line marked out on one side so I know where to stop stitching. I'll cut out everything afterwards, but marking my borders will make that easier. Having extra fabric beyond the pattern outline will help keep the piece from distorting too much in my hands. I've tried using hoops or a Q-snap, but I really do find it more comfortable to just work the embellishing stitches without them. I don't want to stitch into or past the seam allowance on at least one side because I want to be sneaky and disguise that back seam so there isn't a straight line running down the back and the cone and brim pieces look like one homogeneous piece each. Seamless, you might say. Haha! Once the pieces are seamed on the foundation layer, I'll be overlapping the seam, stitching it down, and disguising the edges with thread or ribbon. Don't worry if it sounds convoluted right now, it'll make sense when we get there. I'm not as worried about the seam where the brim attaches to the cone. That can be disguised with some sort of trim appropriately decorated for the season. I'm considering a velvet band or one of my Halloween ribbon findings. That is, if I have the time, energy, and need for it. There are a variety of methods I could use for patchworking. The traditional Victorian crazy quilt method was apparently laying out your swatches on a foundation, turning under the edges, and discreetly stitching them down. That's the method I used for the base of my Victorian pattern that's still in the embellishing stages. It's a fairly time-consuming process. There are quite a few curves and overlaps in the traditional Victorian method. You can skip a foundation and place right sides together, stitch a seam, flop the piece over, iron, and then overlay with other similarly stitched pieces. Some folks just overlap swatches and leave the raw edges to be tacked down with embroidery or trims. There are methods to paper piece or use a tearaway paper pattern to obtain a patterned result. Most of the seamed methods tend to produce straight lines angling around in a vortex pattern, and the foundation fabric can be optional depending on which method you're looking at pursuing. The way I figure it, a crafty person can steal a little bit from each of the methods to randomize their shapes and patterning. My method is a mashup of straight seams and motifs. One of the books I'm using for reference, The Magic of Crazy Quilting, 2nd edition by J. Marcia Mitchler, has a lot of example plates with embroidery stitches, but also patchwork motifs like stars, moons, fans, spider webs, etc. I'd like to incorporate some of those motifs and stitch patterns where I can. Breaking up some of the blocky seams with star and moon patches will help make the patchwork look a bit more random, I think. Needless to say, I don't want to spend the next 6 to 10 months sewing embroidery motifs over each little seam and overlap. I'm using sizable pieces, no teeny tiny scraps here, just not perfectly cut out squares or other quilting shapes, generally speaking. I may have accidentally used a few smaller pieces when I first started patching one of the brim pieces, but that will need some extra attention. Once my swatches are all stuck to the foundations, I can go in and start embroidering over the seams. Not only does it look fancy, oh, you already know, it ensures the swatches aren't going anywhere. I don't have a lot of time to embroider a lot of extra stuff. No outlines of sad beige Victorian children in sad beige embroidery thread. No over-the-top floral motifs. Instead, I'm relying on the stitch resources in my books. If you want a few bare-bones stitch patterns of your own, I recommend A Book of Fancy Designs by Mrs. M. Hainlin and Instructions for Patchwork by J.F. Ingalls, both circa 1884. Both can be found in PDF format on the Antique Pattern Library. If you then feel you're up to a larger scale crazy quilting project, there are a few needleworking resources on the Antique Pattern Library that can be dug up. If you'd like something more modern, the usual digital book vending suspects have a wide variety of materials available. Many crazy quilt books I've found have been either self-published or published through a very small publisher or imprint, so you can find them on Kindle or Kobo or Apple Books. You can also try the library. I'm a big fan of using the library because most of the time it's free, depending on whether you've got late fees and have paid them off, and libraries support authors, which used bookstores do not. Used bookstores and thrift shops keep books out of the landfill, however, so if you find what you're looking for there, have at it. I have a variety of threads and I'm always looking to experiment. I have bog standard DMC floss, which works fine most of the time. Floss comes with 6 strands and you'll quickly find the amount of threads you prefer to work with. My usual preference is between 2 and 3 strands, but sometimes you need to go finer for details, and that's where a single strand shines. I have some number 5 thread from DMC and Michaels, both of which are a bit too thick for my tastes. I much prefer the number 8 thread from a local quilting store. It is more expensive though. It's all due to brand names, I'm sure. The hard part I find is figuring out whether something would look better with some lace, a length or sample of tatting, ribbons, or rickrack. I'm always ambivalent about rickrack. If you grew up in the 70s and 80s, you probably understand why. It treads that fine line between nifty cool, horribly dated, and utterly tacky. It's been 84 years. It hasn't, but this is taking a while. I think I underestimated how much time I was going to need for this project and probably should have started it in July. Something to remember for next year. I've finished the cone. And I'm now starting on the 2 brim pieces. I'm going to try relying a little bit more on trims and laces to try breaking this up and hopefully make things move a bit faster. That said, crazy quilting is super relaxing. I've been enjoying sitting in the recliner and watching or listening to comfort movies. I rewatched Donnie Darko last night, and the husbeast and I finished Gravity Falls and have moved on to The Owl House. I'm not sure what to think of it quite yet. It's really earnest. And it seems a bit weird hearing the voice of Chicha, John Goodman's character's wife in The Emperor's New Groove, as the irresponsible adult witch character. Bit confusing. The husbeast and I have this tendency to listen for recognizable voice actors when we watch these shows, which made Gravity Falls extra entertaining with the celebrity cameos in each episode. Either way, I'm not suffering for things to keep me occupied while I stitch. It's just keeping me from other projects that I'd like to get started. The question of whether to interface both outer layer and lining is a choice only you can make. If you have a strong foundation for your patching, you may decide not to interface. If you didn't use a foundation or your lining is kind of drapey, you may want to. I'm thinking I'll interface both my outer and lining layers just to be on the safe side. I also cut out a canvas layer I can use as a core or just to stiffen the brim. It's good to have options and be able to take things away if they're not necessary rather than having to scramble and add things. Now I have the cone and brim patched and embellished, it's time to assemble. I'm pinning back the overhanging fabric swatches to make sure my seam allowance is clear. Cut out, interface, then I seam up the cone and brim. Trim down any excess fabric near the tip of the hat so we get a nice point. Just don't cut through the seams. Give everything a good press. When that's done, I turn out the cone, push out the point, and flop my overlap swatches where I want them and decide whether I need any extra patching. Secure in place and embellish. Okay, it took me a day, maybe two, but the hat is patched on the seams. So we have a seam here, and then patched over on the other side. You'd barely even notice that there was a seam there. Same thing on the brim. So we've got a seam, and that's the other side. Looks great. So now I need to stitch the cone and the brim together and then put in the lining, turn it out, and we should be good to go. And of course, I've got some ribbon, black, of course, so it won't show up very well. This one says Trick or Treat on it. And I'm figuring that'll go around the seam, the outside of the seam for the cone and the brim, and kind of disguise that. So we'll see how that looks. Attach the cone to the brim, trim the excess fabric and clips so the curve is able to lie smoothly. Assemble the lining as well, but leave an opening in the cone so you can pull the hat right side out once things are seamed up. Again, press out your seams. From here on out, it's kind of like any witch hat tutorial on YouTube. I have my patchwork layer as my main fabric, and I have my lining. Put the two halves right sides together, matching at the back seam. This is particularly important if you modified your pattern like I did. You'll want all the lumps and bumps to match. Sew the brims together, trim and clip the excess so it turns nicely with minimal bulk. You may find it useful to try pressing your seam from the back side before you turn out your hat from the gap you left in the lining cone. Use something that won't cut your fabric or interfacing to help turn out the seam on that brim so you can press it. If your hat has a color scheme that your thread easily blends into without interfering with the other stitching, you can top stitch the edge of the brim. Some folks put in a channel for wire so they can shape the brim. It's a trick some also use in the cone to get that scrunchy effect. I just did a line of stitching 1 centimeter away from the edge to make sure the brim wasn't rolling up. I'm leaving wire out of the equation because this is going to be a hat that hopefully gets worn more than once a year. I'm counting on it breaking in and looking battered all on its own. So let's see what the hat looks like. I know you can't see the patchwork from this angle, but dang, I look cute. This was a lot of work for an unproven pattern hack. Despite my measurements, it's just a wee bit small in the band, and the brim bumps my back, and that's not really all that ideal. I can, however, see it as a good hat shape for shades, so that's working as intended. I'm not sure about the way that I modified the cone. That said, I can style the hat in a couple of different ways due to the shaping, so I'm trying to figure out whether my next version of the hat, most likely as a fairly plain sun hat, needs to be made a size larger. I removed the interfacing on the patchwork cone because otherwise things would have been just way too stiff. I had difficulty pulling the hat inside out, and that's partially due to how stiff the interfacing was. That said, the amount that's there is doing its job. I didn't have time to decorate the underside of the brim, and considering I can wear the hat both forwards and back, that's probably a good thing. Means the decoration isn't getting shuffled somewhere it can catch on my hair. The patchwork is definitely the star of the show, and I didn't wind up putting a band around the seam where the cone and the brim meet because the patchwork is busy enough it's really not all that noticeable. At least I don't find it so. I may revisit the idea down the line, hang a few charms off of it, but for now, I'm happy with it. The husbeast has suggested that I not do more crazy quilting for a while, and I can understand that sentiment. I didn't realize this was going to take a month, and I feel behind on a whole bunch of things I wanted to have done or at least started by now. So I'm probably going to be doing what I can with the time I have. You know, while it's still fall and not winter, though you'd never know that by my local Michael's. I went in to return some yarn, and there's a story there for another time, and they've already sidelined the Halloween offerings and are putting Christmas front and center at the beginning of October. Honestly, some people's children. Happy Halloween and general spooky season to everyone, even you folks in the Southern Hemisphere who are probably sick of North America's strange fascination with pumpkin spice and dead leaves. I'm gonna go do some knitting, maybe some baking.